What's going on, everybody? Welcome into Jacked Ramsays. Danny Marang, Brandon Sprague, and this time we are joined by Cory Jez of the Portland Trailblazers, the on-air analytics guy, as he's so affectionately known as now. Cory, thank you for taking time to join us, man. We really appreciate it. I wanted to bring you on because I'm a giant nerd, as Chauncey Billups called me out in the pregame press conference.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Yeah, that's great. You threw synergy numbers at him, though, right?
Yeah. I threw some light tracking stuff as it pertained to transition defense and after timeout defense. Two things: one thing they struggled in, and one thing that they were doing quite well. And the reason I wanted to bring that up right away is I wanted you to come on, not only to explain your role and kind of how you got here, because it's an interesting path. I always find the path to analytics in sports, they're so varied across the board, across the NBA, people coming from the actual analytics, math-driven spectrum. You get guys like Kirk Goldsberry who came from a geospatial tracking world. There's people who come from true mathematics worlds where you're talking about geotagging and geotracking, or physics, or those that come from the business world. You and I both come from different versions of the business world. If I remember correctly, you were a full stack or worked with full stack development. Along those
done
lines.
Done a little bit of everything, but we'll get into it.
Yeah, and I worked as a business analyst, on the backside of ERP installations and things of that nature. There's so many of these different paths in business and on the education side that ultimately lead down these analytics paths and what it ultimately ends up meaning. So for me, I guess the first thing is, again, what is your path? How did you get here, and kind of the maturation into being the on-air analytics guy for the Blazers?
Yeah. So, well, thanks guys for having me on. Really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun through 10 games now, being part of Rip City, and obviously I've been intimately familiar with the team from other roles I've had in the NBA, but getting to know also the community around the team has been awesome. And that's been a part of this that I don't know I thought too much about coming into it, but not something I had previously in a front office. So it's been one of the cooler parts of it. But yeah, so my path, everyone's path is different. And I think, to sum it up succinctly, the reason why that is, especially as sports analytics, and I will actually probably broaden that when I talk about it here to sports technology or sports information, because analytics is a little more narrow if you try to define it. But those things by definition are interdisciplinary. Like, I have a master's degree in analytics, and it was an interdisciplinary major. It had College of Business, College of Operations Research, and College of Computer Science, or whatever those departments were called at Georgia Tech. There is, there's computer science, there's economics, there's operations research, there's all these things that come into like the science of decision making if you're trying to sum it up into a single kind of phrase. And so my path, graduated Virginia Tech 2011, undergrad in economics. Had never written a line of code in my life when I graduated college, except for like Excel macros. And then first job out of school, learned SQL, database programming language, ubiquitous in kind of the technology world. And 3 or 4 years consulting, Mid-Atlantic, kind of your typical 24-year-old boutique consulting type thing. Got my like Delta Platinum status at 24 and, never looked back, right? But that's about the time Moneyball came out. And it's really hard for me to tell this story without talking about the book and the movie, and what Billy Beane did there, and then bringing it to life, both in the book and the movie, accelerated, this industry, which it's a legitimate industry at this point. Like, people can whine and moan that it's ruining their respective sports, and I'll explain why you're wrong all day on that. But it's a legitimate industry at this point. It's a small industry. It's not healthcare or something, but it's a legitimate industry. And that was accelerated. So, I was a little lucky in that the timing of those things aligned. Like, I was coming out of college. I happened to be learning these technical skills because I took the best paying job I could get out of undergrad, right? And it's like, I learned SQL and Tableau and Python and R. And now I'm learning. I remember the first time I heard what a regression model was. I was literally talking to somebody about fantasy football, and I was like deciding who to draft. And it's like, how much should I weight? Like, how many times a running back gets a ball versus how many times what his yards per carry is. And I'm looking at my spreadsheet of my fantasy football league, and I'm talking to someone like, it's like kind of, you can use that as a regression model. And that was like a decade ago. So I pivoted about 5 or 6 years into my career. I went to work at FanDuel, and so that was me kind of coming into sports. If you guys remember, that was when FanDuel and DraftKings was every commercial on
Every other
television.
commercial, yes.
Oh my God, it was absolutely insane. And then I think there was like a Saturday Night Live parody of those commercials. Like that's when you know you're a cult thing, a culture piece. But did that. That was my introduction. That was like half sports, half business. But I knew at that point I was trying to get a job at a pro team, ideally in the NBA. My father was a college basketball coach at VCU, grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And that's just like my father and I communicate by talking basketball. We still do to this day. I have to explain to him why the game has evolved a little bit since he was a coach in the 90s in college. But one of his best phrases still rings true: "Shoot it before you lose it." And it's still pretty true in the modern game. But I really wanted to work in basketball, and I started just chipping away at that through networking. Because I was working at FanDuel, I could get into some of those spaces, get into the dinners at Sloan, get into the networking. People would kind of take my coffee, cold call, phone calls. I'll never forget. I think it was Kirk Lacob, who was assistant GM of the Warriors at the time, son of Joe Lacob, like took my cold email and emailed me back with, I think I sent him 10 questions, and he, in line responded to all of them. And so I was very thankful to people like that who were just giving me a little bit of time and giving me a little bit, because it's a hard industry to break into, especially on the team operations side, right? If you're talking about going to work for a team in a specific, sport, there's 30 teams. And in 2016, there was like 2 of those jobs on average per team. And so that's 60 job openings. That's your universe of opportunity. And so I was very lucky to get an introduction to then at the time, Justin Zanuck, general manager of the Utah Jazz, assistant general manager at the time, the Utah Jazz. They were looking to really formalize their analytics department. They had one guy there previously, kind of in an intern role, and kind of again more lucky than anything I did. The technologies that like their IT department wanted to use happened to be the things I had been using a lot in my career. The types of databases, the types of visualization techniques, the types of tools just happened to be the stuff they were kind of looking for. So right place, right time. So I was lucky enough to join them, did 3.5-4 years, joined them right after they drafted Donovan, and through the pandemic season as well. And obviously very formative. Dennis Lindsey, Justin Zanuck, David Morway, obviously Coach Quinn Snyder. I walked in there and they thought they might be a rebuilding team. Gordon Hayward just left, just drafted Donovan, traded up from, I forget where they were at, but traded up to 13.
Real quick, what was more important? Donovan Mitchell's insane workout that Dennis Lindley said he was going to kill somebody if it got out,
So
or
you,
the analytics
so you
behind
talked to
it.
David Locke. You talked about David Locke. You talked to David Locke about that story. David Locke loves telling that story. I think the work. So I wasn't there for that workout. I was employed with the team like a couple of weeks later, but so I wasn't in the building for that workout. But yeah, it's a thing of legend around there. I think Josh Hart was also in that workout.
You're kidding.
By the way.
Oh
about
wow,
that?
that's 2 dogs in a
Josh
workout.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and again, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I know Donovan played well. I don't know if that means he did. He played well relative to Josh or alongside of Josh or what. Typically in a draft workout, you'll have 6. You can only have a maximum of 6 players in an official draft workout. For folks that may not know this, you can have 6. So you'll do 1-on-0 drills aside from all the testing and conditioning pieces. You'll do 1-on-0 drills, 1-on-1 drills, and 3-on-3, and you'll play some 3-on-3. And then we had something called the Stockton drill at the end, which is 6 full court layups in a certain number of seconds with your offhand the entire time. And teams are going to do 20 of those maybe in the course of a season, maybe not 20, at least 10 probably. Get 60 guys in over the course of a season. Some are not draft eligible. So Donovan's was a thing of legend around Utah. But the other variables there. Second year guards don't typically come out in the lottery, right? Like second year players are typically not lottery players. If you're a lottery player, you're coming out early, or maybe you're you stayed all 4 years and really progressed, like a Grayson Allen or somebody like that. So that was kind of rare. I also know that Dennis's son, Jake Lindsey, so Dennis Lindsey was the general manager at the time. His son, Jake Lindsey, played at Baylor, 4-year guard at Baylor.
Mm-hmm.
He's now Dobo at Grand Canyon. And that Baylor team played Louisville. And Dennis was visiting with Baylor at the time. And I think Dennis told this on the Woj pod once. Dennis was visiting with Baylor at the time. And they were playing Louisville. So he sat in on the scouting meeting and, they were honed in on Donovan. I think that helped him initially put him on the team's radar as well. But like all things, those are huge group efforts. And that's why the draft, even at pick 13 or going back pick 27 with Gobert, draft night can change the course of a franchise really, really significantly, even without the first or second pick.
Yeah. I'm curious, something you just mentioned there, Cory, and, not everybody is analytically driven in terms of the way that they kind of watch basketball, as you noted with your dad. And he coached in a much different era. Despite what you may have convinced or talked your position with him on in whatever range of basketball, I'm curious, what was the thing or a couple of things that maybe you guys have griped over the most that he's like, no, you don't get it. From the coaching angle, it's this. And you're like, no, but analytically, it's this. Like, what are those, or what were those back and forths like with a basketball coach from the 90s and a guy that's fully immersed in numbers?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is he probably overvalues ISO and guys who can break you down and get you a bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets into another topic that I'll extend into, because I'd be curious what you guys think.
Mm-hmm.
But when Utah was playing well with Donovan, especially before they added Conley, they didn't really Rodney Hood, go get you a bucket. Ricky Rubio is more creating out of pick and roll.
Mm-hmm.
Even Conley's going to create out of pick and roll more often. It was Jay Crowder, Joe Ingles, again, pick and roll, but not doing it in ISO. So there was no second player to go like break you down and get a bucket. Defenses could hone in on Don late game scenarios where who's taking the shot, right? So my dad was always like, you need a second guy to go, you need someone who can draw the attention off, go get you a bucket. Something Portland has with Simons right now in spades. And I always probably didn't value that. I didn't value that nearly as much, because I was like, well, we have the number 3 offense in the league, or whatever we were in any given year. It was always near the top, especially once the Bogey signing and moved away from Crowder and Favors. And I was like, we number 3 offense in the league. I think we're just fine without a second player who can go break you down and get you. But like, I'm probably not optimizing my roster construction for, take a Donovan Mitchell and put a, insert, whoever that player could be, instead of Conley or Ingles or Bogdanovich.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I think we're doing just fine. And so something that's always bugged me in the extension of that, and I've had arguments with scouts about this, with assistant coaches about this day as long. Something that still bugs me to this day about kind of the modern game is how reduced it gets in that late game scenario. I specifically remember it was like a double overtime game against OKC, the Paul George OKC team, which like 2018 in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like 5 minutes of Donovan and Paul George doing you go, I go. And it's entertaining as hell too. So it's just like two bulls in a ring going at it. And Paul George being such a great defender, and he's defending Donovan on that side of the ball. But Quinn Snyder has, and not to say this is Quinn Snyder's fault by any means, but Quinn Snyder's designed an offense that, you guys, we called it the blender, right?
Yes.
You get it going, 1-5 chest, get downhill, force the guy to chop on the weak side help, boom, but we know it's going back over the shoulder, then it's swinging, and Quinn went from number 1 defense in the league to number 1 offense in the league with different roster constructions, and started taking all the threes and stuff, and really got that ball movement with those last couple of teams before they broke it up. So it's like, why are we going away from that? We were the number 1 offense in the league, number 1 3-point shooting team in the league, to like kind of reductionist basketball. And that's not unique to Utah's situation by any means. Pretty much every team does this in a late game situation by and large. It's just, we're down 1 with 18 seconds and we need a bucket. We're going to walk it up, and our guy's going to be your guy.
2016 Game 7, right? Cavs Warriors. It was like the last 5 minutes of that game. It just seemed like everybody was frozen, and you're just playing ISO ball and hoping somebody hits a shot.
And maybe you're playing 1-5 chess, pick and roll, but that's about it.
Right.
It's something I'd be curious if you guys, like, why don't teams run, their down screen actions or off ball actions in those scenarios? It's interesting.
The question I've always had here is, what in human nature causes us to go to that? It's like grabbing a thunder blanket in the storm. It's a comforting place to go to, knowing that you have a guy. And a perfect example is Dame. Dame is a guy who historically, regardless of what analytics, a 1-5 pick and roll with Damian Lillard is one of the best offenses in the NBA.
Yep.
Hands down, no doubt, throughout his entire career.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you look at scoring pick and roll guards, it is him and Chris Paul. That is the list when you talk about the last 15, 20 years in the NBA. If I remember right, his career points per possession in the pick and roll as a ball handler is over 1 still, which is insane.
I'll tell you. Yeah. Average offense is 95 as a benchmark. Average half-court offense. So yeah.
So Dame unto himself at a 1-5 pick and roll basically is an elite offense, and I understand the desire to go to that, but I've always wondered why you can't layer it. Why you can't run additional actions, why you can't go somewhere else with it. But at the same time, when you've got a decade of results, we always talk about data sets and noise and how much data we're working with. With Damian Lillard, you're working with an extensive amount of data. And it's been successful. And I think I don't know where that threshold is. And this is in basketball and in business. There are certain thresholds that you have to cross in order for a decision maker to make a change one way or the other. And I don't know how to get over that threshold in the NBA where you don't go to that. When you've got a record of 1,000+ possessions that comes out on the top.
Dame is run here. We'll put numbers to it. Give me. I have this going back to, I think tracking started about the year he came in.
It's 12, 13.
2012?
Should be, yeah.
2012?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many pick and rolls?
Oh, God.
Jesus.
I want to say he runs like 38 a night. So when he's played, let's see, he probably averaged 75 games. So probably 800 games. So probably right around 3,800.
He's third in the tracking era.
Yeah, in
total,
total
terms of just number of
total volume.
rolls.
I'm going to say 3,800, right in there.
He's third behind Chris Paul, and James Harden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He's won 23,917 pick and rolls.
So that's the screen and rescreens.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's probably
Yeah.
it's probably a response.
That makes sense because when I'm taking the numbers, I'm going off of what is synergy. You're looking second spectrum,
Sure.
right? So for those that don't know, this is a great point. So
This is the weeds of it.
Yes, when I reference synergy stuff, guys, just so you know, that is a result action only. That is a shot, a bucket, a foul, a turnover, or an assist. You have to have a result action. What second spectrum does is track every single action that takes place, regardless of it generating a result.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's probably good. Yeah, it's probably good for people to understand kind of what's unique about what we're doing this year in Portland as it relates to Second Spectrum too. Because Second Spectrum, people don't know that we call them they're the official optical tracking provider of the NBA. There are lots of places to get data: Synergy, Second Spectrum, Sport Radar. The NBA itself generates data sets for internally for teams and for their partners. And so Second Spectrum's a company. I think it's out of Stanford. But what they basically have done is a couple of things. 10 cameras in every arena. They're up in the rafters. They're really small. I mean, they're like a little bit larger than a Game Boy. You really wouldn't see them. 10 cameras in every arena, taking video of all the angles of the court. Sitting on top of that video feed is something called computer vision. Computer vision is basically turning pixels of video into data points. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a 1028 by a 1028 or a much higher def resolution image, you actually turn all those things into data points, and now you can analyze it. That creates a data set that is the X and Y coordinate of every player and the XYZ coordinate of the ball 25 times a second. So now you have this massive data set that ends up being roughly, I think, 3 million data points a game if you play out 48 minutes, 60 seconds, 25 times a second, players in the ball, and officials. Now that you have that data set, I have all these coordinates. Cool. That's helpful sometimes. You want to do very custom fine-grained analysis about positioning. You can use that data set to do it. What's really helpful is you teach with another layer of machine learning. They did this with the Celtics staff back in like 2010 when they were getting started. They sat in the video room and they said, we're going to watch 1,000 pick and rolls. Tell me what that coverage is. Tell me what that coverage is. That's ice, that's blue, that's center field, that's hedge, that's blitz, right? Like go through all that and do that with every sort of machination of handoffs, pick and rolls, drives, different types of coverages, zone and man D. You teach it. So now you have essentially a data set that's labeled. You have the answers, right? So that was zone defense, that was man defense. And you do that 1,000 times or a couple thousand times. Now you can take that back to the coordinate system that you have from that video, and you can learn. That's why they call it machine learning. The machine can learn that, okay, zone defense looks like this in the coordinate system. Man defense looks like this. A pick and roll looks like these things. A shot looks like this, right? If you think about three-dimensional grid of a basketball, it's pretty easy to know what a shot is, actually. Wrap all that together, plus another decade of R&D and a bunch of people, like half their department, their COO, Mike Dioria, played basketball at MIT, and like half their department played basketball at MIT. So they're like the perfect people to do this. And it's ubiquitous in the NBA. It's a league-wide deal. Every team gets a basic package. Most every team also pays for an additional package to give you, I want to see the 23,917 pick and rolls that Damian Lillard has run this year, or since the tracking came in. Portland is the first broadcast group to sign up for this. So what Jeff Curtin and the group basically did, with Mrs. Allen and Bert's leadership, is said, we want to add this. Every team is using this. Let's get this for our fans, right? And that's kind of the whole big picture of what we're doing here. Is, that was previously my role, was to do that for a team, but let's extend that now to the fan base. So let's understand when Damian Lillard passes it to Josh Hart in the corner instead of taking a running floater like he would have been his alternative last night. How much value did that potentially create? And we're actually going to talk about that in the pregame show tomorrow. But we can quantify and do those things. Every team, front office, is doing it. Granted, at varying levels. Some teams have a dozen people. Some teams have one or two. But that was essentially the impetus for this whole program. And it's good to explain, like when you hear second spectrum on the broadcast, or you see those little percentages show up in some of the replays above the players' heads, that's what that is. That's how this all works. And that's part of why I was really excited to do this project too.
Can I take a shot in the dark real quick, by the way?
Yeah.
So some of this is just, it's psychology to a certain extent, right? Because you can't really answer your question unless you're taking into account everybody's team situation, roster building, how a player grew up. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I didn't play basketball in a driveway in the last 15 seconds, count down and go, well, I'm going to pass and screen now to nobody. I dribbled and I shot the basketball. I inherently, basketball, yes, it's a team sport. Yes, some teams do this really, really well. Golden State largely is pretty good, I would say, at the end of games because there's so much unselfishness. But I mean, this is ego. This is guys grew up, like they got themselves to that point. I think it's inherent. I think it's psychology of basketball kind of in itself. It doesn't make the most sense. I don't know how you quantify that with numbers, but I think it's a shot in the dark because I'm with you. How many times do you watch the last few minutes of a game and you go, can we run a play? Like, we're just doing step back threes from 30 feet away. Like, what are we doing here? I think some of it's just inherently, it's kind of a selfish game in that way when you grow up.
I think it's one of the hardest things at basketball at the professional level is the acceptance that we're, there are not 500 Damian Lillards in the league, right? Mm-hmm. But all of those guys were Damian Lillard in AAU. All of them were Damian Lillard in high school. All of them were basically Damian Lillard in college as well,
yeah.
Right?
Right.
And now all of a sudden you got to come in and be Royce O'Neal. And I just use Royce O'Neal because he's like the consummate role player, right? You got to be, Jeremy Grant's played that spectrum of roles in his career.
Sides. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
He's played both sides of it in his career, and now we found the one that's just
the
right.
Goldilocks
So
sweet spot.
yeah, the Goldilocks zone, right? Exactly. So I think that's baseball. That's not a problem. You're a baller left fielder. You just go be a baller left fielder.
Mm-hmm.
You're a baller pitcher, catcher, whatever. You just go do that. NFL, kind of the same thing, right? Like sometimes they switch guys from like receiver to D-back and stuff. But if you're an O lineman, you're the best O lineman, and if you're good enough, you keep going up in ranks, right?
Yeah.
Basketball's the one sport where you get to the NBA, by and large, forget everything you've learned about the game and learn how to play our way.
Yeah.
Not everything, right?
Right.
But we drafted a guy in Utah named Justin Wright Foreman, who Hofstra, A10 scoring champion, absolute walking bucket, 3-on-3, the college 3-on-3 senior tournament, won it with his A10 group, and guys playing overseas, right? Because he's 6'1" type of a guy, and we took a legitimate chance on him, like the 53rd pick. It wasn't a bad pick or anything, but all the guy could do was score. George Niang, Big 12 Player of the Year, right? Iowa State, like certified bucket in college.
Mm-hmm.
And what does he do? Stands in the corners and knocks down three.
He's a movement stretch four now.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the hardest things about adapting to the professional game for a lot of players. Player development programs internally within teams are both with technology and just how they develop their players. Like learning to play pick and roll is a drop big. Like you go watch college basketball, there's not a lot of backpedaling from the fives. They either come up to the level or they switch or they just sit back in on defensive 3 seconds, right? Yeah. So to learn, and oh, by the way, to learn how to do that requires like 5 other human beings, essentially. At least 3 other, because you need a ball handler, defender, screener, defender. And ideally someone in the corner that you're going to pass to. So at least put a warm body in the corner. Or that's going to come help on D, right? Like that's really hard to train. How do you train that? Like you don't need 6 people to train a pitcher in baseball. You need 1 high-speed camera and 1 coach and a catcher. No, you don't even really need the catcher. Same thing as a hitter in baseball. But the dynamic elements of the sport are probably part of the reason we all love it, but make those problems, those questions that, it's 2022 and teams are just figuring out how to implement technology into player development. I mean, every team's a little different. All
wearables and tracking and stuff like that.
Cloak and dagger too, right? But we're just thinking about in the ways that baseball is just miles
decades ahead.
Because for sure. And so it's a really it's what's so interesting about it for me from the technology space, because how can I apply that to the questions we're asking
as it pertains to those questions that are being asked, as it pertains specifically to the Blazers, without going into too much or giving away too much. When you look at just the data sets that we can bring up via Synergy or Second Spectrum, what are the context clues that are popping up in this team? And I use context clues specifically because that's incredibly important when we're talking about the application of this data. Is there's so much that we have now. It's the fire hose, right? As far as folks that aren't used to working with large data sets. It's like, oh, you can look at this. Oh, you can look at this. Oh, you can look at this. And I remember my introduction to this was quite literally, during doing early SQL in like 2003, overseas monitoring like literal terrorist attacks over, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, charting an attack map, and we use that to kind of change our patrol patterns and our tactics around. It's the same kind of theory when you're talking about your application of your defensive principles. Now, Chauncey Billups, certified hooper. Let's not get it twisted. He goes off a lot of feel, but a lot of his feel, I would venture to say, that is based off a lot of those context clues that are bearing themselves out so far for the Blazers this year. Does that sound correct?
I think so. And I think when what we're doing, because we're from the outside looking in, and obviously I'm not in Coach Billups' meetings and nobody who is in those meetings is talking about them publicly, obviously.
No.
But we're kind of inferring it. We're reverse engineering it as really interested fans and our roles kind of covering the team in different ways. And so I think a lot of, and again, I was maybe, and I'm not making a comparison here, but because it's the only coach I've worked with on a personal level, you know, I was probably pretty spoiled with Quinn Snyder because he was just, you know, a information sponge, right? There was nothing that was too out of left field as an idea, or, you know, usually the ideas were his that he wanted to investigate. I mean, look, he went from like the number one defense with Derek Favors and Jay Crowder and Rudy Gobert to the number one offense with, you know, Conley and Bogdanovich. So I can't speak highly enough of Coach Snyder, but it goes back to the principles that are going to be informed by your worldview, essentially. Every coach has a set of principles that they want to play by. And that set of principles, whether, you know, informed by analytics is almost not the right word there. You know, it's formed by their life experience from where they're, you know, where they played in college and did they play professionally and who were their coaching mentors and who did they play under and what worked and how have the game has changed, certainly dynamically, you know, driven by some of this new information that's available. How do they view that? How do they bake that into the types of sets they draw up? How do they do all of those things, right? And we are kind of trying to reverse engineer that from it. And I think what we see, or at least what I see early on, are things like on the defensive side of the ball, a real elasticity, a willingness to do different things has probably been one of the biggest things I've seen early on from this team. And again, contrasting with my previous experience, when you have a Gobert, you don't do a lot of different things. You know, you let him, you know, be the dominant force that he is inside. But small ball, switching lineups, zone, but principled, they don't foul. Number 5 in allowing opponents to get to the free throw line. Like opponents only get to the free throw line 18.5% free throw attempt rate from cleaning the glass. Like they don't get to the free throw line. They don't foul. That's something that coaches are beating into the heads of their guys, right? Throughout, because I think Coach Billups has said it in one of his press conferences. The best shot is still 2 free throws. It's
the worst play you can make as a defender is to foul.
Right.
I think he said that probably 3 or 4 times in pregame stuff. Like, and if he's saying it that much, he's saying it in that locker room and at practice all the time.
And offensively, I mean, it's a team that gets the basket, gets the line, and is a really good shooting team. Maybe the 3-point, when you get to the rim so much, your 3-point volume kind of by definition, because there's only 100% of shots. But they took 37 threes last night, and they were second going into the game. Let me see what they are right now after all of last night's games. Yeah, still second, 40.6% as a team. So there's identities there that we can pick up on and kind of reverse engineer from looking at just team level 4 factors type stuff.
Hey, Cory, when you got hired, I'm curious, what did you decide? Okay, I'm going to be on the broadcast for the Portland Trailblazers. What do you dive into analytically to maybe, I don't know, have some more information outside of just looking at roster construction? And then, like, how much has that information pivoted to, oh, crap, some of these numbers are no good, or this team is night and day different than what some of the numbers would suggest? I know they weren't with Dame last year, but I'm curious what you looked at to identify what this team might be this year and how different those numbers look so far.
I would say 2 things there. One is kind of how interesting that the year-to-year dynamic was. I was spoiled in that when I was in a front office, I had a ton of continuity. Changes, but the 2 or 3 main players basically stayed the same for my entire 4 years. So that's been interesting because usually it's like, especially in your first 10 games, it's like, we were 8th in this whatever thing last year. That's kind of thrown out the window a little bit from an analysis standpoint. And there was no good, well-informed prior, to use a statistical term, on what the team would be going into the year. I mean, aside from, I do think Vegas was a little pessimistic. without any kind of homer bias there. Do think Vegas was a little pessimistic on the team going into the year.
They are every year.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
if you took the over on Portland the last 7 years, you would have won.
Yeah, you've cashed out.
If you took the under on
not
the Lakers,
last year.
If you took the under on the Lakers the last 7 years, you might own them. But so I would say there was it was kind of interesting, a new experience for me in that standpoint, that there wasn't like, oh, we know this is like a 44 to 49 win team. Like a lot of teams you can pretty
bracket
bucket. Yeah. So there was one of the widest range of outcomes of anybody in the league. So that was super interesting. The stuff that I want to look at, the things that I immediately want to come in and look at and start tracking early. And this is why we've structured the pregame shows the way that we have early on. And for folks who aren't familiar with these concepts, but everything at a team level starts at the 4 factors and kind of distills and drills through those. So I know you guys are familiar with this, but the concept here is every team, aside from 2-for-1s, is essentially going to possess the ball the same number of times in a game. Like number of possessions might be 1 or 2 different, but you essentially possess the ball same number of times. So it would follow the only way to win a basketball game is to get more out of your possessions than your opponent does. And there are 4 ways to do that. Make more shots, turn it over less, get offensive rebounds and extend the possession, and get to the line, which is kind of a version of make more shots, but get to the line. There's the only 4 ways to improve a possession, or on defensive side to disprove, not let your opponent do those things. And so those 8 numbers can tell a lot of stories. The stuff I was just talking about, getting to the line, not letting opponents get to the line, being a good 3-point shooting team, getting a lot of shots at the rim. And the research is basically borne out how important each of those factors are. So the order I just gave them in, shooting, not turning it over, getting offensive rebounds, and getting to the line, are in order of importance. And it's like 50%, give or take 50% shooting, 20% not turning it over. That's 70. Call it 15% or 18% getting to the line, and 12% or 18% getting boards, and 12% getting to the line. So by orders of magnitude, shooting is like twice as important as
anything else.
Yeah. Like shooting and everything else aggregates to like the same amount. That's like the statistical validation of the term. It's a make or miss league, right? Which you'll hear me say a lot, because like, look, sometimes you're going to lose games and it's like they shot us out of the gym, shake your hand, go on.
I want to hit on that one in shooting luck and shooting variance, where this is something I don't think. Well, why aren't they knocking down shots? They're open. The whole idea of shooting luck, and it will bear itself out over, particularly the 3-point line. Individual players historically, I know this has changed since then. I believe this proof was like 2014, 2015. It's changed since then. A NBA player, from the time they come into the league until they hit 750 3-point attempts, that was supposed to be the stabilization, normalization point for 3-point shooters. I think it's down to like 500 now because of the skill curve in the NBA being so much stronger on the shooting side than it was historically. Again, this is getting super nerdy. But getting into that, when you talk about the Blazers, right? Let's use the Blazers specifically. Their shot profile has changed dramatically as far as getting to the rim versus taking 37 to 40 3-pointers a game under Terry Stotts historically. Where is that line of shooting luck and shooting variance, and where does it get conflated the most?
I think the hardest thing to do is to not knee-jerk a single game off of it as a fan, right? Even as a front office employee or a coach, Terrence Mann shot the Utah Jazz out of a series. I mean, it just that's
it
the
happens.
That's the guy you literally designed your defense. Like, somebody's going to take a 3-pointer for the other team. Like, if you're put yourself in a coach's shoes, like somebody's taking a shot at the other team. All we can really control is who takes it and where. If we're good at our job as a defense, we can control those things, because we can't turn you over every possession, or else we would, right? Like, so those, I've had games where I just watched DeRozan just cook teams, and it was like, you're probably pretty happy with the game defensively, and you lost by 20 to a Spurs DeRozan that just Chris Paul does the same thing, right? They took what the team gave them, and they're elite at this one skill, and you can't stop everything. And so shooting variance is something. It's why you'll hear me on the broadcast talk so much more about where the shots are coming from.
Process.
Are they contested? Are they catch and shoot? That, because if I go into a game at halftime, if I put myself in a hypothetical coach's shoes, or if I've, not that I've been a coach, but I've talked to coaches at halftime of games before. And what are you deciding at halftime? Do I need to change something in the way I'm playing? Do I need to make different substitutions? Do I need to run different sets? Do I need to change my process? Because we can't control our outcome, but you're asking, do I change my process? And let's say you're down 10 at halftime and the other team went 18 for 20 from 3. You're actually probably in a pretty good spot. Now, if all 20 were wide open Klay Thompson threes, that's not very good. If all 20 were kind of in the normal course of a rhythm, a handful were wide open, but most are, well contested, and, they're not catch and shoot. And
you take the Heat game last night, the first half.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know that it ever got onto the broadcast. I don't think I did a halftime hit last game just because of weird East Coast time. But I kind of came out of halftime being like, pretty good spot. Okay spot.
Mm-hmm.
We going out of the third quarter last night, we had taken 10 less field goal attempts than Miami, and we were only down 8 points. I was like, it's not a bad spot. You got to stop turning it over, but that's not a bad spot. Like, all things can, like, if you should be down 18 with 10 less field goal attempts. So those are the things that I will look at, because if I'm putting myself in the practitioner's shoes here, playing armchair quarterback a little bit, I cannot control whether or not Anthony makes a 3.
Mm-hmm.
I know Anthony is one of the best catch and shoot 3-point shooters in the NBA. So what I can do is control whether or not Anthony gets catch and shoot threes. Is my offense designed in such a way to allow him to do that? Our counters, we know defenses are going to try to take that away. So what are our counters? And all of those types of things. And so the process numbers, I'm going to look at the inputs more so, I think, is a good way to generally classify it. And that's probably going to be the difference in our broadcast than, a defense goes on a run and makes 3 contested threes in a row. And if your input to that as a defense, if you freeze frame when the player releases the shot, are you okay with him taking that shot? Like, think about it that way. That's, it's harder to do, obviously, but we would do that in player evaluation sometimes. So.
I don't know, Cory, if there'd be numbers correlated to this, so this might be a stupid question, but I know one of the big talking points for Blazer fans right now, it's a great season, it's a great start, fun games. One of the negatives for this team seems to be turnovers. I mean, their turnover rate it's pitiful. It's not good so far. They're turning the ball over at a very high rate. I'm curious, is there any way statistically, using any kind of data to track like what the numbers suggest you will be, and like what's the sample size you would need, I guess, from an analytics standpoint, where you start to say, okay, this might just be who they are versus like, oh, hey, this can turn around? Because I know a lot of people are curious about that, and I don't think about that kind of stuff analytically. So like, how would you evaluate that?
Sure. So it's two things. We'll talk about the turnovers, and then I'll talk about like stabilization in general of metrics, because every metric has a different profile. But I think the two halves of last night's game were really telling to that topic of turnovers. Mm-hmm. And I forget which player said it in the interview, whether it was Damian or somebody else in the locker room maybe, but that the first half was just the level of sharpness was not there. The precision, the urgency with the passing, some of those things just were not there. In the second half, 2 turnovers in the fourth quarter. I don't remember how many in the third. But I think it was like 6 total. So maybe it was 4 in the third. I think it was 6 total in the second half and like 12 in the first half. So
second half was 6.
Yeah. So you do see anecdotally in samples that, it took them having their back against the wall a little bit. Maybe you'd like it to not have that to force that out of you. But when that urgency's there, that, they are not necessarily inherently a high turnover team. or they do not have to be. So bringing it back to process again, if I'm looking at that from a coaching perspective or an evaluation perspective, how can I insert that urgency kind of from the get-go? Because the way they protected the ball in the second half is great. If you had 12 turnovers a game, you'd lead the league. You have the fewest. So that would be really great. So I think there is a little bit of give and take with the amount of transition they're running and what Josh likes to do. Like, I think every Blazer fan is loving the transition offense. And look, transition offenses are like 125 rating compared to 95 for half court offenses. So you would have to turn it over a lot to make the transition not be worth it. But those things will kind of move in tandem, where if you run in transition a lot, you'll inherently have more turnovers.
So you're willing to basically say, I don't know what the number is, but X amount of turnovers, it's just going to happen because we want to play this style with this roster.
Yeah, if you were to plot like transition rate and turnover rate, they're not going to be. They're
Fuck
not
around
move
and find out,
one-to-one.
right? Fuck around and find out.
Be a little bit, yeah. So that's to the turnover piece specifically. I would say to the stabilization of metrics, because that's another thing that's pretty heavily researched kind of in the basketball data space is when can we trust any number? You were talking about 3-point shooting earlier. It takes a long time to trust 3-point shooting relative to other things. Like if you're good at the rim, that stabilizes a lot quicker. Another thing, talking about inputs versus outputs, a team's 3-point attempt rate, how often they take threes, stabilizes much quicker to how often they make their threes. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Interesting
though. Your profile, your decision making, your inputs stabilize a lot quicker than your output, and it kind of makes sense. Klay Thompson, best 3-point shooter. Steph Curry, to pick who you want. If they're wide open, it's like a coin flip, give or take, plus or minus a few percentage points depending on who you're talking about. So of course it's going to take a long time to stabilize. It's just the inherent nature of it. Now, to the turnover number, I'd have to look it up where its stabilization goes. There's a guy out there named Krishnan Narsu. I tweeted one of his articles like a week or two ago because we were asking the same thing about defensive rating. They were like, through 5 games, the number 2 defense. I think as it sits today, based on defensive rating 12. I just looked at 12, 112 rating.
There you go.
I use cleaning the glass.
That's literally what I have up right here.
yeah. Shout out Ben Falk.
The OG.
But so 112 defensive rating. People were talking about that early on because they were, they held the Lakers to a very low number. They held a lot of their early games, so their D rating was really good. Defensive rating takes like 16 games to stabilize based on the research. And what we're saying is basically you learn new things as the season goes on about the team. You at the end of the season, 100% about what the team is. So where does that bend in the curve happen where you stop learning exponentially and you just kind of gain new information? Because game 1, game 2, game 3, we're learning a lot about the profile of the team every time. Game 62, we're not gaining a lot of new incremental information about who the team is, right? If that makes sense.
It's the refinement.
So, yeah, and you're just little like shooting or defense or whatever. Like we know who you are, and so those curves kind of like go up and then they really flatten. So for something like 3-point shooting, it might be 40 games. For something like defensive rating, it's 15 to 20. So our general rule of thumb, like 20 games, you can really start trusting metrics generally. As just a good rule of thumb. So halfway there.
Yeah. I have been hammered over the years of being Downer Danny because there was a very real ceiling on what the Blazers had built up until really last year. And along those lines, one of the things that I belabored was their inability to force turnovers and to get out in transition. Now, they're not forcing turnovers at a rate that, the most disruptive teams in the league do, but they're still above where they were, and they're running significantly more than they ever have in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
But there's also a line of they're turning the ball over more than anyone. I believe they're number 1 in the league. Last I looked, they were over 17.6%. of their offensive possessions right now are resulting in a turnover. So almost 1 in 5. League average right now is 14.9. So,
Danny, do you have metrics on the, like, because what Cory said there, like just tempo and pushing the ball? Do you have like where they rank in that? Because I'm curious, like how that, you know what I mean, is playing a factor.
I'll tell you.
yeah, he'll have
Okay.
the better stuff with second
Yeah.
spectrum on that
Yeah.
because all you're going to get is pace, which is adjusted possessions. So
Gotcha.
No. So actually, I'm cleaning the glass. Ben has.
Oh, you're right.
Percentage of possessions which are have a transition event, and I forget exactly what the criteria is a transition event. So, but you bring up a good point. Why is pace a bad metric? And people will see pace thrown around. 50% of pace is possessions per 48 minutes. So if you run up and down 100 times in a game, you have your pace is 100. If you average that out, but half the game's controlled by your opponent. So if you play the Bucks, you're going to have a high pace. If you play Portland 2 years ago, you're going to have a low pace. You play Utah back in my day when Ricky Rubio like snuck it across the timeline at 16 on the clock every time and gave us all a heart attack. You're going to have low pace. If you play Golden State, you're probably going to have a high pace, right? So instead, let's just look at when we have the ball. What do we do? Right?
Yes.
Like this is just new information becomes available. We can make more accurate assessments of the thing we're trying to answer. That is like the analytics paradigm in a nutshell, if I had to sum it up, right? We have more granular information now and access to it. Let's better define speed of play, how fast you play. Let's not include 50% of the data by our opponent. So 17% of their possessions are transition possessions. That is 10th in the league.
Yep.
But the hard effect is they're 7th off of live rebounds.
That's so Cory and I have been talking back and forth about this a little bit because I asked him, I was like, can you tell me what Josh Hart is doing on live rebounds? Because his grab and go skyrocketed even for Josh Hart in the first.
You mentioned
6
it.
or
You
7
mentioned
games.
it on one of our live watch parties too.
Because this was a big part of their transition, and I'm glad you brought that up because this is the question that I had as far as the downer Danny. This is the optimist part of me. There is a rate of return in here for Portland that can be pretty ridiculous in the sense of limiting their own turnovers and getting better in transition, because those are the two things really right now. Their live ball turnovers are limiting their effectiveness both defensively and offensively by taking away possession, but also when they are turning teams over or going off live balls, they are, last I checked, they were in the bottom of the league in transition effectiveness. They moved up a little bit now. They're 22nd now. But that was a problem.
I would think about it a little differently instead of like, it's kind of hard to say I'm going to be better. I'm going to be more efficient when I run in transition. That feels like kind of a maybe a little less sloppy with passes. Not that saying Portland has been especially sloppy, but in general, if you were to try to pull that lever,
Chauncey identified it as hitting singles, simplifying his process. After watching the tape,
not try to hit the home run on the, make the Nikola Jokic type pass, right? Yeah. What feels like an easier lever to pull is run in transition a little more frequently. And even though they're running 10th in the league, when you get that opportunity, run a little more frequently, because that's an easier lever to pull. Because if I'm saying run a little more frequently, even if it's a little less effective, it's still way more effective than a half-court offense in general. Right. And then, hey, nothing's there. Back it out. Don't force it. Let's go to our stuff.
Court. Yeah.
Right. On the turnover side of when they're possessing the ball, it's again, if you're a coach or you're someone on the staff looking at this, it's okay, which of these can we live with? And which of these are, kind of the first half from that Miami game where it just didn't feel sharp. What are, look, if it's a lob, and the lob is otherwise going to result in 2 points, but it slips through the guy's hands, it goes out of bounds, and it's dead ball going the other way. We'll live with it. Yeah, right. Live with it. Yeah, throwing it up to Sharp, and you overthrew the lob a little bit, but it's dead ball. You get back, you get set. No big deal.
But if it's a 45 from the corner to above the break, and it's a lazy pass, and Jimmy Butler may or may not grab one and go.
We saw one. We saw one last night, right? Yeah. Like, and so how much of those levers can you pull? Like. All these things, I try to think about it like, which of those things feel adjustable, correctable? Like, you can't just wish more threes to go in, right? You need to bring it back to the other stuff. Like, but
the rim rate has to go down and the three rate has to go up. That's the lever you have to pull if you're going to go that way.
Right. But you can't like wish the outcomes to happen, but you can control the input.
Right.
So which levers feel easier to pull?
Last one I got for you, Cory, because you've given us a lot of information here, and I think it's been fantastic. Just from probably Utah days, I would say so far, because it's still so early here in Portland. And I know you've worked with other entities in sports, but just in Utah, a moment you remember specifically absolutely pissing you off because you did not agree with either something they ran or a lineup, whatever it was analytically that just got you. You just couldn't get out of your brain. And maybe you got really mad, or maybe you were just like, I really hate that decision, but whatever. Like, what was the moment for you in Utah?
I don't know. All my friends still work there, so I'm trying to expand it to maybe generic NBA, where we can all,
generic. Okay,
we can all take a dig on a mutual third party.
Yes. Okay. Let's do that.
What is a good, like, kind of, I'm having trouble with one right now. I'm trying to think of like a draft pick or something that, like, somewhere in the league I really, really disagreed with.
Yeah.
Or something over the last few years. While I'm like to add a little bit of layer to it. Every team internally, and there's public facing ones as well that are really well built, will build draft models. They'll take all the information we have about the player, their underlying stats, all of those types of things from college, maybe some AAU, their measurables from the combine or the jump to the vert, all that stuff. And you'll build a literal tangible machine learning model to kind of predict the player's outcomes. And every team will do it. And what ends up happening inherently in those situations, and this is not unique to any of my experiences, it's happened every room around the league, would be the model says X. And, like, the model doesn't really say anything, right? Like, the model is what it is, but
there's biased inputs.
There's biased inputs. Like, there's all this stuff that goes on. And so, there's all these things that we understand how it's built, and a lot of our job is to communicate, like, the shortcomings, the understandings, the biases. I think I would go back to Marvin Bagley. I think that's the one, because I think analytically the problem was a problem of availability bias, because there had never really been a player, because Jokic still hadn't won a couple of MVPs at that point. There really hadn't been a guy who was like MVP of MVP, like just blew EuroLeague out of the water the way Luka did. And the way these models work is that, they observe things happen and then they generalize the pattern. So when they see a new thing, they can map it back to that generalization. So unless there's other sophisticated techniques and ways to do this, but I think the Luka question lacked the appropriate information to quantitatively value him.
Wow.
And it took even people in my roles who, I think sometimes, if we're doing it responsibly, we don't paint by number, right? We don't the model says this, take this guy, no questions asked, right? There's lots of times I disagree with my own model internally. Because I understood, the inputs, the outputs, the limitations. And so I think that was one where, even, if we're doing our job responsibly, we can kind of look at that and say, yeah, but we don't have the mapping of, EuroLeague MVP at that age, at that team. I'm trying to rack my basketball history brain, but I don't know that there was one previous to Luka.
He was 101. Yeah.
Right. And then
Rubio was the last time we saw anything like this.
Right. And Rubio's career mapped out to be a above average point guard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Solid above average point guard. Exactly. Probably, around the slot he got drafted. And so there's no input to output map for those things to happen. Now, obviously, the way these models work, there's very complex mathematical techniques, and you can do stuff to account for all of that. But that also implies you have someone whose like full-time job it is to think about just that one problem. Like you go back to Danny, your military experience or other experience, large healthcare, pharmaceutical, pick your industry.
Mm-hmm.
You have people whose entire job it is to think about this one little line of a problem.
Yes.
In a front office of basketball team, when I started, I was the only person working in Utah. We ended with 4. Sergio Oliva, who's now assistant general manager with Portland, if for folks who kind of kept close tabs, hired like 5 people when he came in. And Portland now has one of the larger analytics departments in the league. And so he's working to create this time and space and ability to look at those micro problems, those very nuanced technical challenges. But when you're also like doing opponent prep and we're playing in the playoffs, getting ready for the draft, and we're getting ready for the Clipper series and all this other stuff, right? Like, how do you're not able to go that deep on stuff. So that one is not so much something like I vehemently disagree with, but a really interesting case study of the application of
a process evaluation.
Yeah.
I put you in such a bad position there. I just want to say that was an amazing way of flexing out of that question. and by the way, numbers be damned. We didn't need numbers. The general manager of that franchise knew Luka and his family, and he knew how good he was. He was like, Bagley.
Well, to be fair, the general manager of that franchise is not the general manager of that
franchise. Yes.
The owner of that franchise. Monty McNair is like one of my mentors in this business. He's an awesome, awesome human being. And I think he's done a really good job there given other organizational constraints.
We'll get you out of here with this, and I won't take any more of your time because it's been tremendous. You alluded to it a little bit, talking about the size of the analytics department growing here in Portland and growing in Utah. Despite the idea of the eye test rulers of the kingdom thinking that analytics are ruining basketball, analytics are just getting started in basketball. What have you seen and what do you kind of hope to see going forward from that community and the growth and the different things that they can get into that allows for more knowledge? Because talking to Dwayne Hankins, the president of the Blazers, one of the things when I was told you were being come on and like the shape of the broadcast was, how do we make the fan base smarter? That was the thing, because that has to happen alongside this, because right now baseball fans are the smartest fans in sports.
Okay.
They have access to more data. You've got guys on Twitter like the Pitching Ninja who will break down every bit of spin rate. They can detect when a pitcher's fatiguing or if there's something on the ball or when guys are picking up tipped pitches. Like, there's so much out there right now just on the pitching element. That's before you get to the hitting element, the fielding element, the base. There's so many micro skills that are out there. Like, what excites you about kind of the future of analytics in basketball?
So to follow the baseball tangent for 1 second, there was something really interesting. I tweeted about this that happened in the World Series. And if you followed the Astros closely, this is like, I'm not watching baseball super closely throughout the summer, but when it comes down to the playoffs, I tune in a little more. The Astros pitching does not follow a typical pitch sequence. It doesn't go fastball, changeup, slider, or whatever, kind of the traditional thing would be. And the implication there is that they've got a better understanding. Like, they'd never threw Bryce Harper a changeup, I think, the whole series, or an off-speed pitch, the whole series, right? And there's other guys who they never threw a fastball to the whole series, regardless of who the pitcher is, by the way, or including that information of who the pitcher is. They still don't do it. And what you're kind of inferring from that is, and what analysis you're reverse engineering is, not just they understand that, like, this guy can't hit up and in, but the path of this guy's bat relative to the action on this pitcher's ball. That's actually what we're saying when we say, like, Harper can't hit off speed low and away or something. What we're actually saying is the path of his bat combined with, where that ball breaks, how much vertical break, horizontal movement, speed, gravity, all that stuff, right? That's what we're actually saying. For decades and decades, the only information we had was, what does Bryce Harper hit on off speed, low and away?
Yeah.
Well, 60 miles off speed, 70 miles off speed, 80 miles off speed, 90-mile sliders nowadays, and stuff that breaks across or drops the table, right? Those are all different pieces of it. Breaking balls are not all created equal, And so what Houston's doing, or what the implication that Houston's doing, is they've mapped all of that actual data, bat path, obviously pitches and breaks and spin rates and those things, and they're exploiting kind of their marginal edges that way. So now map a process like that to basketball. Haven't even thought about it. I mean, as an industry, we just are getting comfortable with tracking data. I mean, 3/4 of teams probably don't have someone in their front office. Actually, probably almost no teams, maybe outside of Portland, Philly, Washington, kind of the larger, more OKC, now the Knicks, teams that have staffed up in such a way and put, geospatial or statisticians on staff that, this is PhD level stuff. I mean, it's a guy named Justin Jacobs, and when he's not doing basketball, he's doing missile tracking.
Yep.
For defense agencies.
Yes.
There's guys I know in baseball who, baseball teams took them from autonomous driving projects like Carnegie Mellon, because mapping fly balls is kind of the same thing as mapping autonomous driving. Like, that's the level of stuff we're talking about. And you need to dedicate resources to those specializations. So I think the generalization was analytics. It's, let's use numbers to find undervalued players, right? Moneyball 1.0. And that's still kind of, where I came into it, because I had to be generalized. I had to do some web development, some data science, some data engineering, all the things to make all the stuff run, which meant I was not inherently great at any one of them, right? It's, jack of all trades.
Generalist, yes.
Yeah, I was a technical generalist and still am. But if you bring in a Bayesian statistician with a PhD like the Washington Wizards have, or you bring in someone with, missile tracking like other teams have, or you bring in the best front-end developer who could otherwise be working at Google or something, well, that front-end developer is going to build a system that your coaching staff's going to love and want to interact with every day. And that gets into a whole nother organizational psychology bit that we don't have to go down into. But most teams have not made that commitment. And this is where I come back to saying this is information. Because guess what? That web technology, that web platform that a coach or a scout might use also has scouting reports, also has, shot charts aren't really inherently analytics anymore. They're just shot charts, right? Like, it's there's no model. There's no PhD level math there. What your video room is cutting up all the different types of sets other teams run. Let's match that up with all the other data and understand teams' offensive efficiencies based on different sets. That the amount of work able to do that is just being unlocked. And I think the lead that was buried in Moneyball, and maybe this is a good thing to leave it on, the lead that was buried was not like analytics versus scouting. It was, let's run $2 billion organizations like $2 billion organizations.
Bingo.
That's it to me, because if you look at other industries, it's just the application technology to be more efficient with your resources, and that's all we're talking about here. Enterprise
resource management. Yeah, it's really what it comes down to, whether you're talking about UI, UX, and how those iPads play into an assistant coach on the sideline adjusting something based off of those data points. It's how it's packaged, and I think that's again, I'm glad you said that, because that's. I always try to, again, this is kind of the flag that I've taken up, so to speak, is that I want fan bases to be smarter. I want this fan base to be smarter. In pre and post game questioning with Chauncey, I always want to ask basketball related questions so that we get something more out of this. And if he wants to call me a nerd, he can call me a nerd. That's fine. I'll throw on my nerd glasses.
You are a nerd.
I am a nerd. It's fine.
It's okay.
Cool, but I'm glad that the Blazers are doing this. I'm glad they're bringing this part of this in there. I'm thrilled that you came on here and kind of help explain this. I know you've got other stuff that you do on the side. And I shouldn't say on the side. It's other stuff that you do beyond this in the analytics spectrum across various sports. So the applications are endless, and stealing from those different sports and those different kind of thought processes is always an interesting thing for me to at least go down that road. But again, I don't want to take any more of your time, man. Thank you very, very much. Let everybody know where they can find you, where your work, and everything else as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels like all of Rip City's found me on Twitter already. But I mean, that has definitely been an aspect of it. That's a lot more, frankly, more fun, to interact with a fan base that is as passionate as this one is about their team. Hopefully we'll, finish the season with a 70% win rate, because it makes my job a lot easier.
Significantly easier to do TV around.
Yeah. Dan Hyatt and Jeff Curtin have been giving me, so much crap. Like, man, we should have made you do this last year.
Break you in on that team.
Oh, yeah. Man.
Well, thanks again, man. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for hopping on with us, man.
You can find Cory on Twitter at JezData. You can check out his website, and you can see all the other project and stuff that he's working on there. And you can catch him during all the Trailblazers broadcasts in your score bug, popping up in the bottom of the screen. Again, thank you so much for joining us, man. Folks, like, rate, review, subscribe. Help us grow the show. If you're watching here live on YouTube or if you're watching on the replay, please click subscribe and help us grow. We continue to blow through everything that we did last year record-wise, and that's all because of you guys. So thank you again. We will have the back-to-back Wednesday and Thursday, so we'll probably try to pump in some post-game shows somewhere in there. And then we'll take a little bit of a break. We'll bring back the mailbag on Sunday. Other than that, you can find us on social media at Danny Marang, at Brandon Sprague, at Jacked Ramsays. Email the show, jackedramsays@gmail.com. Until next time, guys, take care.